We can try to get started. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Jerry Firestein, Director of Government Relations, Policy and Programs at the Middle East Institute. It's my pleasure to welcome you to MEI's second annual conference on Yemen here at the National Press Club. Today's conference will bring together experts from Yemen and the United States to explore pathways forward for Yemen and potential areas for international cooperation to end the conflict. Well into the fourth year of civil conflict in Yemen, there are few signs that the current impasse, which has persisted since the summer of 2016, is about to change. Hopes for progress in resolving the ongoing civil conflict were disappointed last month when the Houthis, one of the key parties to the conflict, refused at the 11th hour to participate in meetings to be hosted by UN Special Envoy Martin Griffiths in Geneva. In the meantime, the situation on the ground around Hodeidah, the main port of entry for supplies to 75% of the Yemeni population, is stalemated after the launching this spring of a much anticipated offensive by the Saudi-led coalition with support from a melange of Yemeni forces. Successful transfer of the Hodeidah port from the Houthis, either militarily or through a negotiated handover, has been seen as a potential game changer to support the UN negotiation strategy. The humanitarian and economic situation on the ground is similarly bleak. Despite a new $200 million cash injection from Saudi Arabia to prevent the collapse of Yemen's economy, on top of the billions of dollars it's already provided, it continues to struggle economically. In recent days, the Yemeni rial has plummeted to a new historic low of some 800 rials to the dollar. Widespread food insecurity continues to intensify, and documented cholera cases have tripled following the intensification of fighting in Hodeidah. Just yesterday, the Southern Secessionist Movement renewed its call for an uprising against the Hadi government in Aden, where violent protests since the beginning of this year have added to the instability in that part of the country. Amid this chaos, the UN is redoubling its efforts to restart a peace process under Martin Griffiths' leadership. What is the outlook for negotiations to end fighting in the country, and can the UN process lead to a sustainable peace? With internal security and political challenges posing the greatest threat to peace, how have human rights abuses worsened since the outbreak of the conflict 3 years ago? Here to answer these questions and more, we have two expert panels. The first will examine more closely the challenges confronting negotiators, as well as within Yemen, that complicate the prospects to achieve stability in the country. The second panel will focus on Yemen's political economy, humanitarian development, and human rights. Before I introduce the speakers of the first panel, please note that this conversation is being recorded and live streamed. Please silence your mobile devices, but we encourage you to tweet using the hashtag #MEI Yemen. Be sure to check MEI's website for upcoming events and conferences like this one. MEI's annual conference and gala will take place on November 7th and 8th at the Marriott Wardman Park Hotel. Visit mei.edu for details and to buy your tickets for the gala. Additionally, I'd like to thank our sponsor, GardaWorld, and our friend, Pete Dordal, for making this conference possible. Stay tuned for future conferences like this one on Libya and the Horn of Africa, also with the support of our friends at GardaWorld. Now, please join me in welcoming the speakers of the first panel. If I can ask them to join us on the stage. Ahmed and Sama and Tim. Okay. Yeah, there's a step here. Yeah. So let me introduce, I think that probably many of you know our speakers already. Ahmed Awad bin Mubarak has assumed his duties as Ambassador of the Republic of Yemen to the United States in August 2015. Formerly, Ambassador Mubarak was a director of the Presidential Office and Chief of Staff. Prior to taking up his appointment as the director, Ambassador Mubarak was appointed on January 2013, in January 2013, Secretary General of Yemen's National Dialogue Conference, we remember it well, leading a team of over 120 staff facilitating the mediation process among the participating 565 delegates and providing technical assistance to the NDC working groups. Additionally, during his tenure as the NDC Secretary General, Ambassador bin Mubarak co-chaired the steering committee of the multi-partner Peace-Building Trust Fund. Following the successful conclusion of the NDC, Ambassador Mubarak was appointed on January 25th, 2014, to be a member and rapporteur of the Regions Committee. Samal Hamdani is an independent researcher and analyst focusing on Yemen. She's currently a visiting fellow at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University and a research fellow at the Sana'a Center for Strategic Studies. She's also the director of the Yemen Cultural Institute for Heritage and the Arts, a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., dedicated to Yemeni art and heritage. In the past year, she's provided analysis to the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center. She also wrote the blog Yemeniati.com from 2010 to 2015. And then Timothy Lenderking is Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Arabian Gulf Affairs in the Near East Bureau at the U.S. Department of State. A career member of the Senior Foreign Service, Tim served previously as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh from 2013 to 2016. He served as Director of the Pakistan Office at the Department of State from 2010 to 2013. From 2008 to 2010, he completed 2 tours in Baghdad, the first as a senior democracy advisor at the U.S. Embassy, and the second as the policy advisor to Lieutenant General Charles Jacoby, or maybe Jacoby, commanding general of multinational forces Iraq, based at Camp Victory. Before his Iraq tours, he served as economic counselor and acting deputy chief of mission at U.S. Embassy Kuwait. He was also the political counselor at Embassy Rabat from 2002 to 2006. So thank you all three for joining us here today. And let me begin with you, Ambassador Mubarak, and ask if you could share with us some thoughts on your perspective about the political and security situation in Yemen, and also what is the view of the government of Yemen in terms of where we are in the political process and how to go forward.
Thank you very much, and allow me at the beginning to express my appreciation to the Middle East Institute, and to you, Jerry, especially, and for the excellent arrangement as usual. 4 years now, up to now, since this conflict and this crisis started, and yet, unfortunately, we didn't reach political settlement yet after all the catastrophe and the humanitarian mess that Yemenis people are suffering from. Our position since the beginning is the same. We didn't start this war. And ending this war, it's in the hands of the Houthis. We believe that there is no there is no military solution for this crisis, but yet having a certain level of military pressure is important, is a must, because without that, I think we cannot reach, we cannot, push the Houthis to go to the table, and it works. It proved that it works. It happened in 2017, even before Geneva, when the Special Envoy Martin came, and I think things start moving because of the military pressure. ending the coalition intervention in Yemen without solving the roots of the problem, in Yemen, the national causes, I think will not end the conflict in Yemen. Maybe even it will worsen the situation. So I think we have to pay more attention on solving the local level, the causes, the roots of the problem, not just pay, as it happened now from the International Committee, just focusing on the regional factors, not to the local reasons. To reach political solution, I think it needs first willingness from the Houthis, and to do that, I think many factors need to, come together from the Yemeni government, from the International Committee, and from the region. And just give you, an example about what happened in Geneva, in the beginning of September, and I think, we raised the expectation. Everyone thought that things start moving. The special envoy Martin Griffiths, he sent a lot of positive signs. He went to Sana'a for the first time after his Ismail. He couldn't do that. Even they attacked him in his last visit in Sana'a, and we start for the first time to discuss the agenda, and we agreed on starting with the confidence building, measures, focusing on humanitarian issues like, the salaries, which affecting most of the Yemenis, the humanitarian access, the detainees, a lot of issues. We thought that if we started from this point and building achieving something and get some quick wins, that will maintain and the relations, and we can start discussing the entire and the comprehensive political settlement. But unfortunately, Houthis, they decided in the last minute just not to show up. Our delegation, senior delegation, they went on time, and they, and they were, ready to discuss all the issues as we agreed with the special envoy. But in the last moment, Houthis, they came with some conditions, and they linked their participation with issues like getting a new plane from Muscat to Sana'a, then from Sana'a to, and they started putting some condition like getting some unidentified people at that plane without any verifications. So they put a lot of reasons. We believe this is not a genuine reason, but this is what they did. And even we were flexible, because in that time when we were discussing these kind of logistic issues, Mohammed Abdel Salam and Abdel Malik Al-Ajri, who are senior negotiators, they were in Muscat. And we offered that, until we solve this logistic problem, we can start. If Mohammed and Abdel Malik can join us in Geneva, so two seniors from the Houthis delegation, two seniors also from our delegation, so we can start and we can send a positive message to our people. But unfortunately, that didn't happen, and I think we have our explanation for that. Since we discussed these issues, we told Martin that we think it's premature to start this kind of negotiation now. We thought that Hodeidah will make more pressure on the Houthis, but then after we faced this kind of pressure from the International Committee and we paused our advances towards Hodeidah, I think Houthis believe that they succeeded to stop the campaign against Hodeidah. So why they have to accept any kind of power sharing? Beside that, I think the conflict between Houthis and the GBC, and I think after the assassination of Saleh, I think Houthis lost a lot of the political cover that they used to have when they were with GBC and Saleh in the same campaign. So a lot of internal factors, regional factors. I think Houthis, they were not ready to go to Geneva. The conflict between the two major faction within the movement, the military faction and the political faction, those who they didn't want to give up, and those who think that we have to respond to the international demands. So the decision wasn't there. So that is, for that reason, they didn't show up. Still, now I think Martin is trying now to resume the talks. He's talking about November, I think, or something close to November. Again, he would like to discuss the same agenda, starting with also the confidence building measurement. Clearly we discussed that with him in our last meeting with him, and we told him that we are ready to support him and support his mission. But I think again he has to be more confident that Houthis will come. Otherwise, I think we will lose the hope. And I think in Yemen, it's very important to manage the hope of the Yemeni people. Otherwise, I think that will have a negative impact on the entire situation.
Which is a very good segue to Sama and to ask in particular if you could follow up on the ambassador's comments. I think that this is one of the critical questions: is how are people inside of Yemen responding to this? How did they respond to what happened in September? What exactly are people thinking in terms of their own hopes or expectations that this conflict is going to come to an end?
I think that's a great point to start. And first of all, I want to thank you, and I would like to thank the Middle East Institute for taking the initiative to have Yemen for a second year as a major topic of discussion. Seeing so many faces in the audience actually gives me hope that there are people out there who care about Yemen, who realize the graveness of the humanitarian situation that's taken place there. And I think I would like to start with the last point that the ambassador raised, which is the concept of managing hope. You would manage hope if the Yemeni people had hope. I would say for the Yemeni people, you would have to start by just giving them a slither of hope. And in that regard, I would like to start by emphasizing facts that we all have read in newspapers over and over again. The humanitarian crisis in Yemen is the reason that everybody is pressuring for peace. It's no longer about politics. It's no longer about what side is going to win. It really is about the 11 million people who are really starving and the 22 million people who are in need of a dire assistance, immediate assistance, and the children where one child is dying every 10 minutes in Yemen since the start of the war. This is really the reason that I think a lot of us are here today, is to kind of see and to stop that in a way where the regional actors and the Yemenis can kind of come together and figure a way to allow aid to come in and to end the political starvation and the strategic starvation of Yemen in this war. What I would like to say is that political settlement has been very difficult to achieve and realize in Yemen. I think the closest we've come to a political settlement has been since the Kuwait talks, and that was in 2016. Everything since seems to be kind of a delay strategy from one side or the other. In this case, in the September 6th, specific consultations, it happened to be the Houthi side, where previously it was also from the government side. So what we see as outsiders looking at this dynamic is that both sides are not fully committed to peace yet. Both sides are not willing to come to an end and kind of agree that peace is ultimately the answer. I think the ambassador raised an excellent point that I kind of fixated upon, which is the government's position has not changed since the start of the war. And I don't think that's an optimistic thing to hear, because you would like to hear that the position slightly changed in hopes of achieving peace in Yemen. The problem is the Houthis on the other end have become far more powerful in Yemen than when the war started. And this is really what's alarming to the majority of the Yemeni people. And by that, I mean that at the start of the war, the Houthis had to share power with forces of former President Ali Abdullah Saleh. Since they have now had complete control, the territory that they had to share with Saleh is now entirely their own. And on top of that, I think that they are completely in control locally of the areas that they're in. They don't even need to set up checkpoints, is what we hear from the locals on the ground, because their security is airtight. And what's alarming as well is that at the start of this war, the Houthis were not able to launch missiles into Saudi Arabia, which means that they've developed this capacity since the war started. So in a sense, as a Yemeni, I'm afraid of extra Iranian involvement during this war. It seems that the Houthis are getting stronger and stronger, and that's not an ideal situation if we are looking to have Yemen become a civil state, a democratic state, a state where elections can take place in the future. So in a sense, what we've seen in the past 4 years is that the sooner we reach a political settlement, the less complicated politically Yemen might be. And then also the 4 years of war, we've seen the destruction of infrastructure, the spread of diseases like cholera, the dengue fever, things I've honestly never heard of before are coming up and showing in Yemen. And then on top of that, the situation of the internally displaced people, which was exacerbated by the Hodeidah attack. The Hodeidah attack really pushed a lot of people outside of their homes and sent them to be internally displaced in other regions of Yemen without having proper camps, without having a proper way of kind of setting up a refugee status or a way where these displaced people can have some sort of security or medical aid. I think the September 6 talks were referred to as consultations. They weren't talked about as peace talks, and I think that was a very appropriate title. I think UN envoy Martin Griffith, who is the third Yemen envoy to deal with the situation, had to kind of realize what other envoys before him had to face. So in a sense, it was kind of nice for him to kind of hit this wall in order to see how difficult it really is to reach a peace settlement in Yemen. And I'm happy to hear that he is trying again to kind of reach a deal. In the past few days, you've actually mentioned in your starting speech that a few important things have been happening. One is that the southern Iraq in the south have kind of called for a call for secession. And of course, we know that this is not, anybody who's been following the southern Iraq issue in Yemen, this is not the first time that they call for secession. But we know that they are doing so again because the Yemeni rial has crashed. Now, the dollar at the start of the war was 215 Yemeni rials. It was 250 rials by 2015 and kind of stabilized for a while. And then recently, just in the past month, it crashed. And now the issue is, if Yemenis can't afford anything because $1 equals 700 Yemeni rials, they can't afford any goods, it's easy to see why not just the southern Iraq, but anybody under Houthi-liberated territory is going to be infuriated. Because some of these lands have been free from Houthi influence, yet they have not had the stability or the security that they deserve. They haven't had the restoration of services that they need to have. And I think ultimately for all Yemenis, it is essential that the Yemeni government returns to Yemen and to operate from Yemen in order to gain the trust of the people. Which brings me ultimately to the issue of peace building. How do you build peace in Yemen? How do you build peace when nobody trusts anyone? Clearly, the Houthis don't trust the government and vice versa. But outside of that, this conflict is no longer about the Houthis and the government. We have many other actors that are now part of the equation that we are not factoring in our peace process. And our peace process is going to have to be a multi-step peace process that begins with the cessation of just exchanging fire. So it begins with a ceasefire. It begins with the UN putting a lot of force on the people who are fighting in Yemen to just stop the exchange of fire before anything else happens. Because then you have to start dealing with the economic situation in Yemen. You have to start dealing with how do Yemenis, the ones who are displaced, how do they go back home? What do we do? And it's going to be, you've just destroyed, Yemen is a young country. So Yemen is a young country. It started in 1990 as a unified country. And since 1994, they've had their fair share of problems. And you've spent the last 4 years launching a war campaign that left thousands and millions of people without salaries, without safety, without security, exposed to disease. How do you fix that? You don't fix it with a peace settlement. It's a 10-year process. And so, like I said, it begins with the cessation of fire, and then it goes into negotiations that will have to be unique to each area. And on that note, it's important, since we are in the United States, to talk about the role of the United States in this. The US is, I think, confusing to some of the Arab speakers and the Yemeni actors in Yemen, because on the one hand, they support the Arab coalition and Saudi Arabia fully. They are supporting them by refueling of jets. They're supporting them by, providing them strategic targeting and logistic assistance. But at the same time, every once in a while, a drone strike would hit Al-Qaeda, an Al-Qaeda suspect, and that suspect would sometimes be on the forces that are fighting with the Yemeni government or against the Houthis. And so from Yemen, from the Yemeni perspective, the US fully supports this conflict, yet sometimes I've heard people say, oh, the US supports the Houthis now because they're against us and they're doing so and so. And so it's kind of conflicting, because they're also, they're selling 110 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, but then Nikki Haley at the UN would say something like, we are fully committed to peace and we would like to see peace first and foremost in Yemen. And so in that sense, we have an American problem here where, what is America's strategy towards Yemen? I think they want to see peace in Yemen, but at the same time, they don't want to lose their friendship with Saudi Arabia, which is very important at this time.
Well, and on that note,
Perfect segue.
we have the person who can tell you what the American strategy is.
Good, well, thank you. And let me just, first of all, thank you, Jerry and MEI for hosting us today. And as with Sama, I'm really encouraged to see so many people here coming out with an interest in Yemen. I do think that all these problems that we're talking about are going to need a collective response. Not everybody in this town, let alone around the world, is on the same page with what needs to be done. But there's no single country or entity like the UN that can solve this problem. And ultimately, a lot of the things that we're talking about here are challenges for the Yemenis themselves. And I think we as outsiders can do a lot to help set the stage. Even that has proved difficult at times, but at the end of the day, Yemenis are going to have to come together in a way that they perhaps haven't in a long time, or certainly not since the national dialogue process, to address the core issues of the direction of the country. But for us, we have really key objectives and key interests in Yemen. You could look at several things that I would point to at the top. One is, we're very disheartened to see the way that Iran engages in this conflict and helps perpetuate it. And that is done through support and training to the Houthi militias, provision of sophisticated armaments, sophisticated enough that the Houthis now can attack major metropolitan areas in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and in the UAE, and we should have no bones about it, that is their intention. And so this is an unacceptable situation for us as the United States. These are core partners for us in the region, the Saudis, the Emiratis, other Gulf countries, and as part of the administration's policy on sort of getting tough on Iran, Yemen is a key area for us to try to do that. Secondly, with the growth of ungoverned spaces or chaotic areas inside of Yemen, this creates opportunities for Al-Qaeda and ISIL to proliferate. And so this is another issue that we have to be very attentive to. As you know, Al-Qaeda was largely pushed out of Saudi Arabia over the years. Many of their fighters moved into Yemen, and it is incumbent upon us to continue to focus, I think, on the threat that they potentially pose to the homeland and to our regional partners, not to forget also the extremist ideology that they propagate. And third, if you look at the coastline of Yemen, the Bab el-Mandeb on the west side and the entrance to the Red Sea and ultimately the Suez Canal, the very important role that geography plays in this conflict and for our interest, where the amount of shipping and world commerce that goes through this strait is really vital to in fact, the world economy. So, I would point to those three areas as really core interests for the United States. We have very much tried to support and continue to support the efforts of the UN in terms of pushing a political track here. We had a number of engagements in New York last week at the General Assembly with Martin Griffiths, with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, with the President of Yemen, looking for ways to push this process forward. Because as I think Ambassador bin Mubarak said, we also believe there's no military solution. We do believe that a certain amount of military pressure is appropriate, but it's a very delicate thread, because too much military pressure has led also to rampant civilian casualties, and that is a big problem for us. As Sama, you note, we are providing some support for the coalition. It is less than it was at the beginning, and there have been parameters placed on that support. And we do have a fairly blunt dialogue with the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Saudi-led coalition on how they use these weapons and the importance of preserving civilian life. And I would say, quite honestly, it's just above a passing grade here. And that is to say that we will continue to evaluate this situation and push for improvements. And we do have assurances from the Saudi leadership that they are committed to this effort, and we intend to hold them to that.
So can I follow up with you for a moment, Tim, and just pursue this issue of the coalition? And one of the things, obviously one of the issues that's been debated fairly hotly here in Washington and elsewhere, London and elsewhere, is in fact these questions, these doubts about the performance of these militaries in pursuing this conflict, and whether they're taking appropriate precautions to limit civilian casualties. But the other part of the question about the coalition has been whether or not they are wholly committed to a political resolution of the conflict. Have they been as supportive as they could be, should be, in helping Martin Griffiths secure a negotiated way out of this?
On the second point, I do believe from our consistent conversations with the coalition leadership that they are committed to a political solution. Maybe our timelines are slightly different. We have a much shorter timeline. We're not interested in seeing this conflict prolonged. We would like to see, the Iranians pushed out of Yemen ultimately, but that's a very tough goal to set. And we would like to see that the military pressure is applied to the point where we get parties around the table. So again, efforts to get to support Martin and push at least representatives of the Yemeni government and the Houthis. Maybe it can be expanded later to other parties in Yemen. I think that would be appropriate, but we need to start small here. And even as I think we've all noted, that has proven to be difficult. In terms of the performance of the militaries, Secretary certified recently, that Secretary Pompeo, that the Saudi-led coalition was performing satisfactorily in terms of supporting a peace process, in terms of supporting efforts to mitigate civilian casualties. That in no way was meant to imply that this is a perfect grade, that there isn't a huge amount of work that needs to be done. If you talk to U.S. military who are involved in this effort, they will say that the Saudis have made progress, and I'm talking about Saudis who know the efforts quite intensely from being up close. But there's certainly room for improvement, and I don't think you'll see any let up in our commitment to that particular goal.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Sama, I want to turn one of your points back on you, and that is you talked about peace building. You talked about the number of actors that are out there beyond just the Houthis and the government. You talked about what seemed like a multi-phased approach to resolving some of these issues. Of course, in the 11 to 14 timeline, that was in fact the approach that the Yemeni leadership took, and as Ambassador Mubarak can testify from his own personal experience, that was in fact what the ultimate objective of the National Dialogue Conference was, that met for over a year and produced hundreds of recommendations about how to address some of these underlying causes for the conflict. How would you now, having learned from the National Dialogue Conference, and I know that you personally were very much involved as an observer, as a reporter of that conference, having learned from the issues, the challenges of the conference, going forward, how would you recommend that negotiators try to structure a new approach to resolving some of those issues?
So thank you for asking that question. So just for the audience, when the National Dialogue was taking place, it was set to be for 9 months. And it was an elaborate process where we had 565 members organized into 9 committees where they would discuss Yemen's issues. The way that the dialogue was set up, the way that Yemenis referred to it, and the reason that there was a lot of critique to it was that it was very isolated from what's going on with Yemenis. And the Yemeni government at the time put a lot of its failures into saying, wait, until the national dialogue is complete, when it succeeds, all of Yemen's problems will just kind of be fixed. So they had a marketing issue in the sense that they made it look as if the national dialogue was Yemen's only way out. And I had a problem with that specific approach because they had no plan B. It was national dialogue, it was all or nothing. And the national dialogue itself, like I said, was a huge process that involved 565 actors in Yemen to come and resolve Yemen's problem, when indeed what we needed was probably 10 people, no more, to come together and agree on some things, and then to carry out the resolutions of this dialogue. And by that I mean that the 2 main issues that we see as grave in Yemen today, the southern Iraq issue and the Houthi issue, were not resolved. As a matter of fact, they were exacerbated. So for the southern Iraq issue, it was the people whom they selected to participate in the national dialogue were not really representative of the grassroots leadership that was taking place in the south. They were part of people who were from the south themselves, but were not really connected to what the streets really were calling for. And then at that time, the Southern Iraq movement said that they want nothing to do with the national dialogue. And it was just this very murky, messy process, which led that committee itself to kind of take a break, and the leadership of it changed. So it was just a really elaborate process that could have taken a different route. On the case of the Houthi issue, allowing them their own committee, in a sense, could have been a mistake, because they allowed them all to come into Sana'a and operate and kind of create their own political, this was the first time the Houthis had come from Sa'da into Sana'a, and they were presented as a group that had a grievance. They were able to start their own political party. They organized themselves better than anyone else, and then they took advantage of the chaos that they witnessed in the national dialogue process in order to take control of the government. So those were 2 specific groups. One of the groups that I thought was really important was the Committee for Transitional Justice and National Reconciliation. Now, one thing about that specific dialogue was whatever decision was taken in a specific committee was to be applied to other committees. And I thought, how can you have transitional justice and national reconciliation without engaging some of these other committees directly and constantly every day? Because they're just so intertwined with each other. And the problem with that group is that the people that they selected, again, were not actual power holders. They were proxies of power holders in Yemen. And I think that made it a problem, because you weren't dealing directly with the people who are in charge. And the issue of transitional justice and national reconciliation is actually a matter that I'm focusing on currently to see how can we achieve something that all Yemenis can agree upon. How can we take something from, kind of a peace process that is applied elsewhere and Yemenize it? And what I mean by that is Yemen has its own ways and methods of dealing with issues. And it usually involves tribal mediation, a qatshu, a way to sit down and negotiate deals. I think that route would have saved Yemen a lot of money and perhaps even saved it from the war that we see today. Now, the issue is the national dialogue, to some people would look back, they would say, oh, the national dialogue in Yemen failed. It was all a waste of time. But we know that after the war started in Yemen, the UN, the World Bank, other people who endorsed this process are still holding on to the findings of the national dialogue and would like to implement it in a future government because they really worked hard on this stuff. But ultimately, can Yemenis agree to this? Is, one of the things that really gave the dialogue a hard time was how would Yemen look in the future? Is Yemen going to be 5 federal states? Is it going to be 2 states? How is Yemen going to look like? What is it going to be? How are they going to operate? To this day, it's not really clear how Yemen is going to be. And to be honest, I haven't heard either the Houthis or the government or anyone come up with very clear steps of this is what we would like to see in Yemen. This is how we think Yemen should be. This is our solution to the economic problem in Yemen. This is, just kind of a clear outlook of what the future of Yemen would look like. That remains murky. To say that we will follow the outcomes of the national dialogue is just kind of blowing smoke again because it needs to engage the Yemeni people and what they want. And at this point, the outcomes of the national dialogue after 4 years of war might be void, null and void, because you've created a new dynamic where the animosity between people has shifted. Those vendettas have shifted. What does transitional justice look after 4 years of war vis-a-vis how it looked 4 years before the war began? It's going to look completely different. And so in that regard, I feel that the national dialogue was a very good initiative that kind of was too large for what Yemen's problem was. The idea of having multiple conferences in a hotel just, when you could have just brought all the political leaders, the former president, the new president, the people who are instigating the actual problems, everybody in Yemen knows who is behind what. And so it's easy to bring those individuals and to engage them in conversations behind closed doors for the sake of peace.
You want to?
Yeah, well, a lot of to comment. Yeah. Well, let's start with we as Yemeni government, we didn't change our position from the beginning, meaning that from the beginning we believe that using peaceful tools, peaceful instruments is the only way to solve the many problems. We weren't the one who started the war. Coming back to the national dialogue from the beginning, well, Houthis came to Sana'a before the national dialogue, you know that.
They were in the camp.
They were there before even the national dialogue, and the parties themselves, will come to, the Houthis. The conflict in Sada, started, before that. So when we started, the preparation committee and to address what is the main problem in Yemen and how we will solve it. Sada was one of the main problems. And I agreed, we made some mistakes by accepting Houthis and dealing with them just as a political movement without taking in consideration their ideological background. And I think giving them the same privilege that the parties enjoyed with, while they are at that time, occupying, part of Yemen, and they are using, military, tools to solve their problem, and they were trying to impose their way of thinking on the other Yemenis. I think that was one of the mistakes. But in that time, most of the parties, they thought that Yemen entered a new era, and we want to get rid of Saleh. We want to build new Yemen. It's the time to think about the future of Yemen. And the main, the national dialogue. The main issues were answering the structure of the state, how we can share power, in Yemen, how we can build, centers in entire Yemen, not just centralized, state, ruled the entire Yemen from Sana'a. I disagree with Sima, with all respect to her opinion, but I think national dialogue was trying to discuss the Yemeni dream, not. So the Yemeni government, their main duty, according to the GCC initiative, is to solve this kind of day-to-day obstacles and problem. But the national dialogue main mission is to draft a new constitution for Yemen and try to resolve all these historical problem and trying to get a new cohesion in Yemen. And the first time we saw NGOs, young people, women, fully empowered, freely discussing their issues, and I think we practiced a new thing in Yemen. I still believe it's still it's not outdated at all. It's the only solution. It's the only consensus that we have as Yemenis, and the starting point. Even by the way, the NDC outcomes. It's something, but all these outcomes, reflected in a draft of constitution, and that draft of constitutions discussed among just 17 people, 17 members. Not hundreds, just 17. They took a look to all these NDCs outcomes, and they reflected in a draft of constitution. And in the day that when they abducted me, the Houthis, we were in our way to announce the launching of public consultation, which means the Yemeni will have the right to discuss article by article, item by item in this constitution, and nothing will be imposed, including the number of region and the other issues. In the end, I think we have to have kind of referendum. Then the Yemenis, the ordinary people, they will say their last say. So again, I think we can just open the discussion and discuss. But I believe the only consensus that we have, and we can start from it, is the NDC outcomes. Why we face all these challenges? Because you have Saleh at that time, Houthis, who they realized that if they let it go, then they will not have control anymore. And not just Saleh and Houthis, but who they are representing. So they thought that they have to stop this process, because if they let it go, then they will lose power. And they don't want that. There are many issues. Easily, I can clarify it about the Iraq representation. A lot of historical issues. I think I don't want to waste your time. But again, returning back to the narrative of that Houthis are getting stronger. I think this is wrong. This is totally wrong. Just I remember when we start, when Houthis, I still remember a personal private talk between me and Mahdi al-Bashar, by the way, who is now the president of Houthi version of Yemen. He thought, Ahmed, you don't have any room anymore in Yemen. The only place that you can spend the rest of your life is the Saudi hotels. So, and in that time, they were controlling, everywhere. Most of the south, the entire north, a lot of areas. Now, while we are talking now, our national army, they are controlling 3 big districts in Sa'da. So we are just 7 kilometers from the holy village of Abd al-Malik al-Houthi. So now we are in Sa'da, we are in Hajjah, and we liberated huge area in Hajjah. In Hajjah, sorry, in Nahm, in different places. There is no governance in Yemen that we don't have representation, or we have troops, or we are controlling. Houthis are losing in every day. This is military. Again, I'm not saying this is the only way to solve. But Houthis, they are losing, the game. I'm saying, controlling Yemen. So this is one. Second, look how Houthis dealt with Saleh, their main ally, and look to the situation now in Sana'a. Our people, our relatives, we have the situation in Sana'a now is trouble. Houthis are facing real challenges now in Sana'a. Just if most of the Yemenis just few weeks ago, for the first time, Houthis start to commemorate, Ashura in Yemen. And this is with all respect, but this is not a Yemeni issue. So we never had such red flag and Ashura issue, and so, thousands of people with red flag in Sana'a. Yemenis start to realize that their main attention is to build and to have their own sectarian state. And look, how Yemenis start to to counter that. For the first time, ordinary Yemeni, simple young people, the last celebration of the 26th of September, the way that they celebrated 26th of September,
which is a national day.
Which is the national day.
Right.
You start seeing Yemeni young people on the commercial malls, holding the flag and singing the national anthem. Yemenis start to rise. What's Houthis' main intention, to Yemen. So their situation inside Sana'a, everywhere, they are much weaker than before. No doubt, more Iranian and Hezbollah, support to the Houthis, because they are using Yemen as a card among the other cards. They are trying to, but again, setting up the narrative that as Houthis now are stronger. About examples about the liberated area. Why not? I didn't hear anyone talking about Marib, Mukalla. Just few weeks ago we received tens of journalists, and they went freely, and they met with the people, and and they published a lot of reports about the security situation, the economic situation in Marib, as an example for the liberated areas, also in Mukalla. Now, in his last brief, Martin, he talked very positively about Taz, and how the governor of Taz and the other officials start to secure and to have more stability in the city. So there are a lot of good examples, despite of the challenges. No doubt that in Yemen, that there are still, it was and still a lot of proposals, especially with the South questions. It was before, and it is now, and we will hear it until we resolve this problem. We cannot fix the South issues on the other issues before end the war.
Right.
And to end the war, we have to end the conflict, the cause of conflict, not just getting out the Saudis or the collusion, but and leave the Yemenis fighting each other for years. So I think this will worsen the situation in Yemen.
Great. Thanks, Ahmed. And before I want to open the floor up to take people's questions, but let me just pick up very quickly on one point. And ask Tim again. I think, and Tim, you also mentioned the issue of the Iranian role, and the question of how you address that side of the conflict. And I think that that most of our commentary, most of our emphasis over these past 3 years has really been about the coalition, about what that side of the conflict is, how we can influence Saudi or Emirati or government of Yemen views and positions. But how do we address the other side? How do we address what the Iranians are doing to support the Houthis?
Of course, we don't have direct contact with the Iranians on Yemen, so it's not as though we can sit at a table and work this out. But there are really two elements to that strategy. One is to increase the cost to Iran in general, in terms of its what we feel is aggressive or malign behavior in the region, whether it's agitating Shia groups in some of the other Gulf countries, or whether it's it's full-on backing for the Assad regime, or support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, or building up a Hezbollah-type structure inside Yemen, which seems to be a goal of theirs. And as I mentioned, enabling the Houthis to target civilian areas inside Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So all this, I think, we find very pernicious. So increasing the cost to Iran for having this kind of engagement is one piece, and then number two is trying to cut off specifically the flow of their supplies into Yemen, and that's a great challenge given the rugged nature of the coastline and capacity problems of border officials in Oman and on the Yemen borders to police their own country to prevent Iranian weapons from entering the country. So that's, these are not easy things to do.
Great, thanks, Tim. We have about 10 minutes left in the hour. I'd like to invite people to come forward. I think we have microphones here and over here, so if you would just come forward, and we'll try to take as many questions as we can in the last minutes. Let's start over here.
American State Department representative. I'm concerned to hear you talking about titrating the pressure so that we can deal with Iran. I think cutting off weapons is fine, but we have interests in all of the Middle East and the Gulf. And seeing American planes piloted by Saudis, owned by Saudis, with dropping American bombs on civilians is not going to help us in the conflict. It's not going to, the Iranians will simply do more. Already things have been ramped up instead of being ramped back. I don't think it will make any difference in our policy to Iran to kill a lot of Yemeni civilians. And that's something we can control.
If you have a question, please.
Yes. Don't you think that would be a better way?
Well, certainly it's not our policy to kill Yemeni civilians, nor is it the Saudis' policy, nor is it the Emiratis' policy. It is the Saudi and Emirati policy to go after Houthi infrastructure or infrastructure that is used for their war effort and to launch missiles into the kingdom. Let's not forget, the Houthis are not charming people. We've always said that there's a role for Houthis in whatever government emerges. We certainly support that. An organization that has death to America in its slogan should not be something that we should have any countenance for. I made the point that we have to redouble our efforts as the United States to ensure that U.S. supplied weaponry is not hitting Yemeni civilians. I've talked about the challenges in doing that. All I can do is assure you that that is a key goal for us in Yemen.
Okay, great. Thank you. And could I ask that you identify yourself before your question?
Sure. Is it working? My name is Elena Deloja from the Washington Institute. My question is for the ambassador. I'm wondering if you can talk about the logistics behind salary payouts. So there's talk of many people on government salaries not being paid for, some people say it's a year, some people say it's 2 years. I'm wondering, is everyone not being paid for a year or 2 years? Is it just certain areas? What are the logistical challenges? Why aren't people being paid? When will they be paid? Everybody got a 30% raise recently, but if you don't actually receive the check, that doesn't really matter. So can you just talk a little bit about why that is a problem?
In the liberated area, most of the Yemenis are receiving their salaries. Mainly the civilian. Since the relocation of the central bank, we have a problem in the areas controlled by the Houthis, and that was one of the issues that we were planning to discuss it in Geneva. Our offer was that if you want us to be responsible of all Yemenis, including those in these areas, then we have to have control in the revenues in these areas, because Houthis are collecting now the revenues, which is based on the panel of experts reports, last report, UN reports, that they are collecting 70% of the Yemeni reviews. So Houthis are controlling and collecting more than 70% of the Yemen revenues, and they don't want to be responsible of paying salaries. So we proposed that we, as Yemeni government, the central bank of Yemen, can be responsible, and that the Prime Minister stated that in his last speech, that we will be responsible, paying all the salaries for all the Yemenis. But we have to ensure that one entity can be responsible and control all the revenue. So this is one of the problem. Now there are some initiatives by the UN and some of the international committee. They want to focus more on the health. Workers, teachers, these kind of jobs, associated with the life of people, and they are trying to find some fund, for that. We are open, and we are, it's a serious issue. It's an issue in Yemen, and we are trying to resolve it.
Okay. Please.
Hi, I'm Dion Nissenbaum with the Wall Street Journal. I had a question for Tim. There was a story today in the Associated Press from Yemen talking about Hodeidah, and the story said that Secretary Pompeo's decision to certify last month was effectively offering the coalition a green light to go forward with Hodeidah. Is that the message that the U.S. administration meant to send? Is that the message that the coalition should take away? And then stepping back more broadly, there is an ongoing debate in the administration, as you know, about whether to provide more support to the coalition. The argument is if we want to help them get better on civilian casualties, we actually need to do more to help them, to get in the room with them, to provide them with more targeting, and I'm wondering what your view is of that. Thank you.
Thanks. On the first point, no, it is not our position. We're not trying to send a signal for the coalition to move on Hodeidah. We have had a pretty robust dialogue going with the coalition for a couple of years now on the importance of the humanitarian lifelines that go through Hodeidah. We cannot risk a disruption to those lifelines. And moreover, I think we have agreed with the coalition that Martin Griffiths needs space to operate. And so a big offensive on Hodeidah, this is not the time to do it. And so that's our position. With regard to the debates in the administration, yes, there are debates, and I'm glad there are, because people have strong views about how we should go forward. I've laid out principles that I think everybody in the U.S. government rallies around in terms of why we're doing what we do. But I think you'll find that there will continue to be support for the coalition. We may look at one could look at whether that needs to be increased. For example, if we want to get at the problems of hitting civilians, is there an even more robust role that we should play? And so that is among the issues that we debate. You are right.
Please.
Fatiha Belfaqir from Voice of America. I have two questions for Mr. the Ambassador. The first one is I want to know the position of Yemeni government on Iran and Saudi Arabia interference in the conflict of Yemen. And earlier you mentioned and you talked about implementing some military pressure on Houthis, but are you for or against the U.S. Political solution? Because they are talking about peaceful solution and you were talking about military solution.
Well, from the beginning, we believe that there is no military solution for the Yemeni crisis. That was our position from the beginning. And this war imposed on us. We didn't start the war. And people, mistakenly thought that the war started in March 2013 when the Saudi intervened in the Yemeni. It started in July 2014, months before the coalition came. It started when the Houthis started moving towards Amran, then occupied Sana'a, then towards the south, then attacked the presidential palace in Aden, and so we believe up to now the only solution for the Yemeni problem, for the Yemeni crisis, is political solution. But we believe also from our experience with the Houthis, that without a unified international message strong as we are experiencing now from this administration, and we highly appreciated that. And without certain level of military pressure, Houthis will not come to the table. And that we went with the Houthis four rounds of talks in Geneva, one, BL, then Kuwait, more than 100 days in Kuwait, then recently in Geneva again. In Kuwait, we were very close to reach a political settlement. We as Yemeni government, we already signed the UN proposal, and it was comprehensive political and security proposal, made by at that time Ismail Wad Sheikh, sponsored by the international committee. Houthis refused. Now everyone is talking about Hodeidah. Just to remind you, Hodeidah is not a new issue. 2 years ago, when we start also talking about liberating Hodeidah, not attacking Hodeidah, then we face the same pressure from the international committee. And then Ismail Wad Sheikh came with a proposal, and we said, well, let's resolve Hodeidah issues. And we discussed this issue in your office, Ambassador. You remember that, me, you, and Abu Lahum. And Ismail, he picked it up in that time, and he came with a proposal. And we, again, as the Yemeni government, we accepted that. Houthis refused. And after that, no one talked. All the reports saying that, 80% of the international aid, coming to Yemen through Hodeidah. While also all the statistics said that, Hodeidah people, the people of Hodeidah are, in much, they are suffering, much than any other governorate. How comes that, Hodeidah port, just few meters from them, and they're not getting any aids, because Houthis are, using this kind of aids in their smuggles, and they are making money of it. So our position from the beginning is that we have to resolve this problem using political means. We are ready to do that. We think that the references, and we did a lot of compromises. In Kuwait, we did that. So yes, we insisted that the framework for the resolution is the 2216. But in Kuwait, we accepted to deal with that framework in certain limit of flexibility. But Houthis refused. So that need to be clear.
Okay. I'm afraid we're out of time. Sama, Tim, any last words, any last thoughts?
If I may.
Please.
I think that one of the things that we didn't factor in is the young population in Yemen. The majority of the Yemeni population, which is 29 million roughly at this point, are actually people under the age of 25. And with the war going on, the reason that militias and other military or militia forces on the ground are gaining force is because lack of employment and lack of other options. So as long as the war continues, it's easy to recruit these young people and to bring them into fighting when their livelihood and their future is going to rely on generating jobs. Right now we're in a war economy, and there is a specific group of people who are benefiting from the war continuing on the ground, and it tends to come from all forces that are participating in the conflict. Some elements of it benefit from the war continuing as it is. And I think that what the UN and the US and other powerful countries can do is kind of put out a plan to help young people find jobs in order to avoid recruiting them. As the ambassador said, there are new things that are emerging in Yemen that weren't part of the Yemeni tradition. And the reason for that is it's so easy to recruit young people for your cause if you can fund them, if you can bring them in. And so the easiest way to solve Yemen's problem is to allow people to have money so that they can provide for themselves in an honorable way in order to pay for their food and to have services restored to the people, electricity, clean water, all these basic services. That is a key to solving Yemen's problem.
Great.
Yeah.
Tim?
I want to just add 2 points to the answer that I gave to Diane about giving space to the coalition here around Hodeidah. It's not open-ended. It is not indefinite. In other words, I don't think that we want to find ourselves here again, bless MEI for hosting us, in a year saying, where is that political process? So there's a sense of urgency, and we expect that through the combined efforts of the various parties that we're going to get people to the table, because all the issues that we're talking about here can hardly be solved or tackled if we don't have a dialogue going between the major combatants. And secondly, it's unrealistic to expect coalition forces to remain outside Hodeidah while the Houthis retrench and resupply, and while these forces remain vulnerable to snipers and other types of attack from inside Hodeidah. So I don't want to create the sense that this is an open-ended situation. If we're going to shake up the status quo, we've got to do things that apply pressure in the right places to get the parties to the table.
Great, thank you. Please join me in thanking our speakers, Ambassador Ahmed Awad bin Mubarak, Samal Hamdani, and Tim Renderking, for this really excellent discussion. We're going to take a 30-minute coffee break. Wow, 30 minutes. And we will return here for our second panel at 3 o'clock. coffee and snacks outside, but fortunately it didn't seem that you needed my encouragement to do that, so I'm glad that everybody was able to get a break. For our second panel, we're fortunate to have a diverse group of human rights and humanitarian experts joining us. This panel will be moderated by Marcia Biggs, who we're delighted to have here from New York. Marcia is a special correspondent for PBS NewsHour, for which she's recently won a Gracie Allen Award, a first-place National Headliner Award, and a New York Festival's World Medal. Her expertise lies in the Arab world, with over a decade of experience in the Middle East, 5 years of which were spent living in Lebanon. For PBS, she covered the targeting of doctors in the Syrian civil war, the use of children in armed conflict, the looting of Syrian antiquities, as well as the plight of Syrian refugees in both the United States and the Arab world. For PBS in Iraq, she covered various stages of the battle for Mosul, documented the plight of Yazidi girls who have escaped ISIS captivity, and told the moving story of American military veterans volunteering on the front lines against ISIS. Most recently, she became one of the few television journalists to cover the crisis in Yemen, which she did in a 4-part series for PBS entitled Inside Yemen. For those of you in the room and tuning into our live stream, please remember to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag MEIYemen. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Marcia, who will introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yes? I want to thank the Middle East Institute. I'm very honored to be here as part of the discussion on Yemen. It's often a topic that, it's called the Forgotten War. So I was thrilled that this event was happening and that I was asked to participate. So thank you. I'm joined by Bruce Abrams, who is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Middle East Bureau of USAID, which oversees programs in Yemen, Tunisia, Morocco, and Libya. He came to the Middle East Bureau from Zimbabwe, where he served as Mission Director for USAID. You've been a Foreign Service Officer for USAID since '99, serving Colombia, Iraq, Egypt, and Peru. Is that right?
Yep.
Next is Abdul Rahman Al-Ariani, who is an independent economic development specialist. He served the last 5 years as the Principal Economic Officer at Yemen's embassy, focusing on development assistance and economic reform projects, advising the leaderships of various Yemeni government agencies, including the Ministry of Planning and International Cooperation, the Ministry of Finance, and the Central Bank of Yemen. But he's here today as a free agent. And then last but not least, Andrea Presso is the Deputy Washington Director for Human Rights Watch. She was previously the Senior National Security Counsel investigating and analyzing U.S. national security policies and practices. She's a former attorney representing the Office of Military Defense as well as detainees at Guantanamo. So I want to thank all of you for being here today. So I'm going to start with you, Bruce. We already heard the previous panel about the disastrous humanitarian crisis going on in Yemen right now, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, it's called. I was there in the spring, and what I heard time and time again was, from people on the ground, was that the aid groups that are here are helping us put a Band-Aid on the situation, but which is very important in saving lives. But what is USAID's goal, and how are they trying to create a more sustainable situation? And especially, we're sitting here talking about reconstruction when the conflict is ongoing. So how are you dealing with that, looking towards the future?
Well, thank you for the question, and more globally, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to talk about Yemen, and just that groups like this, like MEI and others, keep a Yemen dialogue going here in Washington and other places, and that's so important for our work to inform us and to help us shape our programs according to what we learn in fora like this and from interactions during coffee breaks and connections that we make. So thank you, and thank you for including us in this. You're absolutely right that, that we can't be planning for a future that we're not in without addressing the current situation. And USAID has a robust humanitarian assistance program in Yemen, focused on food assistance, focused on the cholera situation. But what we recognize clearly is that humanitarian assistance alone won't address some of the issues we heard about in the last panel that Sama raised, for instance. It won't prevent the institutional collapse that we see happening in Yemen. It's not going to stem the tide of conflict, both the overall conflict and the local conflicts. And it's not going to build Yemen's and Yemenis' ability to have a resilience to this and future shocks. So while we are putting that bandage on that's so important to stop the bleeding, we also have to look at the patient and get the patient healthy in the long term. So, so what we've done and what we're doing is looking at some of the issues that we heard about in the last panel that we've discussed. For instance, the lack of cash in the economy. So when we talk about the food crisis, absolutely, there's a lack of food in country, but also there are places where there's food coming in, there is some food on the shelves, and Yemenis do not have the cash, the purchasing power to be able to buy that food. So it's not just bringing in the food, but it's, for instance, fixing the banking sector, working with the central bank. It's now in Aden, but working with the banks in the regional areas as well to help bring cash into the economy and help Yemenis be able to access that food. It's also working at the local and in some cases the national level for us on building institutions focused on service delivery. We can only do so much on the humanitarian side if all of the institutions of governance, all of the economic institutions, like I mentioned, the banking sector, and all of the civil institutions are falling apart. Yemenis have an amazing history of coping mechanisms, but that can only go so far. So what we're trying to do is to address those longer-term programs. And I think one of our questions is how can we do that when we're not actually in Yemen? Because we left Yemen in 2015. We shut down some of our programs. Some of them continued with the UN on early recovery efforts in education, in health, in livelihoods. But what we've done now is to create a strategy. It's a strategy based on scenarios, recognizing this is a very fluid situation. And from that strategy, we've teed out some development outcomes that I've kind of laid out. And but we've recognized that we don't know exactly what's happening on the ground. But there are a lot of groups, international groups, Yemeni groups, Save the Children, Search for Common Ground, global communities, some of which we're working with now, who have been on the ground in Yemen. They have a Yemeni staff. They know what's going on. So we've put out general solicitations and relied on those groups to come up with the ideas, the art of the possible, if you will, that'll work on the ground. So we're moving ahead with a development strategy, again, that addresses some of the drivers of conflict and some of the long-term implications of the conflict, while at the same time, we're not pulling back on a real robust humanitarian effort.
You mentioned trying to shore up the economy, and in 2015 it was mentioned today that the rial was 250 to the dollar. When I was there in the spring, it was 500. Now it's reached 800. So perhaps this is a question for you, Abdul Rahman. Sure. How do we achieve what he's talking about, trying to shore up the economy? That's the first part of the question, and then the second part would be, if you're looking at reconstruction in an area where there's still ongoing conflict, but yet there are areas of the country that have been liberated. For instance, in Aden, right. I didn't see buildings being rebuilt, schools being rebuilt. So how do we go forward? What are the challenges of reconstruction if that is the model?
So you mentioned the currency. Let me address the currency first. Okay. Because this is the Yemeni rial. It's not the Turkish dinar or lira. There is a humanitarian component to the Yemeni rial crisis. You see, we import 80% of our food and medicine needs. And any drastic fluctuations with the exchange rate, instigates inflation. And so there needs to be an intervention, and a credible one from a monetary side and a fiscal side. At the moment, we are really monetizing the fiscal deficit, meaning we're printing money to finance the budget deficit of the government, which is mainly payroll. And the issue is we need to work on the fiscal side, work with the government and the budget, and see, how can the international community, most likely Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, can intervene and assist with financing that deficit instead of using this inflationary method of printing money. And on the monetary side, we need to curb the supply growth of money. It's unsustainable. And as long as we have these two simultaneously done, this will help stabilize the currency. And unfortunately, the intervention, the donor intervention of this issue is necessary because again, the deficit is the issue, is the driving force behind the instability of the currency. Now, in general, this reconstruction theme, and I was involved in a workshop over the past 2 days, there is this feeling that still we are using reconstruction since World War II. The concept and the framework is very inflexible, rigid. There are areas in Yemen that are not as rosy as Aden. I mean, it's unfortunate what's happening in Aden, but there are other regions that are experiencing post-conflict recovery projects. They are community-led and driven, and this is where the donor community can come in. And these are opportunities that can help the donor community by identifying what can be done. Big multilateral donor organizations or bilateral organizations, they sometimes find it very difficult to intervene in a country like Yemen, very, with a hostile security and the economic situation. But what needs to be said here is that the communities across Yemen, there are various communities who are proactive. In Hadramaut, in areas in Marib, in areas in Ta'az, and in the far north too, even in areas controlled by the Houthis. There are somewhat of proactive communities that we need to use a bottom-up approach by identifying what is it exactly they're doing. There's something happening because people want to continue living, and assist in the financing aspect or in the empowerment aspect. There are national capacity. I mean, there are national institutions that can help the donor community. They exist. The Social Fund for Development in Yemen is a very well-respected organization. It's a Yemeni organization, and it is the question of how can you make this reconstruction framework flexible enough to have it work, to make it work for Yemen, and so this is where my remarks are about this issue.
And how do you do that in an area that is so fractured, especially if we look at the South and we heard from the Southern Transitional Council about trying to get people to go out into the streets to protest. How do you go forward in the manner in which you're speaking when there is so much conflict between the locals?
I mean, Yemen has multiple identities. There are many areas across Yemen where there's some regions that are, for example, Aden, they're experiencing instability. So why do we need to tax other regions of the instability that's happening in Aden? So what I'm trying to arrive at, we can have multiple reconstruction plans for different areas because each and every area is in a different time horizon with their conflict. I mean, some of them are exiting the conflict and some of them have exited completely and now they're in the recovery process. So it's about identifying these areas and using a bottom-up approach instead of a 35,000 feet level approach. Because yes, what's happening in Aden for the past couple of days is just taking over the news, and so it makes you forget about these other areas that are improving. And so no, my suggestion is. Yes, this is taking a lot of chunk of the news, but there are areas that you should use a bottom-up approach in identifying these opportunities.
Andrea, I want to turn to you as we talk about reconstruction going forward, considering the massive human rights violations that we've seen really on both sides. what are the challenges in going forward and trying to, say there is peace? How do we then go forward and try to create a viable society?
Thank you. It's great to be here. I think the big challenge when it comes to the human rights concerns is the utter lack of accountability to date. And you said people call Yemen the forgotten war. And from my perspective in policy circles here in Washington, it's not the forgotten war. People talk about it all the time, but they talk about the humanitarian considerations. They don't talk about the human rights issues, and often that's a very deliberate choice. Human rights concerns are swept under the rug. And in Washington, that's in part because the US government has a degree of liability. We've long said the US is a party to the conflict, joined essentially the coalition some time ago, and the US and the UK and France continue to sell weapons to the Saudis that we have documented are used in violations of the laws of war. So I think in part because of that reason, although also in part because the humanitarian considerations are so overwhelming, human rights considerations are really not addressed. But just to give you a brief summary of them, which I think you are all pretty familiar with, the UN has documented over 6,500 civilians have been killed in the conflict and over 10,000 have been wounded. These numbers are most certainly undercounts. It's very difficult to get those numbers. Human Rights Watch ourselves, we've documented 87 unlawful attacks, some of which we believe are war crimes. And we've done some detailed investigations into individual attacks as well as into the investigative mechanism set up by the Saudi-led coalition, the JIAD, the Joint Investigative Assessment Team. And we found that to be utterly inadequate and just utterly irresponsible in terms of any accountability to the civilians in Yemen. We've also documented abusive detention by all parties to the conflict. And when you're looking forward, thinking about reconstruction, I think you have to ask what will the new Yemen look like for people who have suffered these years of war, for civilians who feel that they're at risk of unlawful attack from the air, they're at risk of unlawful attack from the ground, people are detained for political reasons on all sides, people are subject to torture, whether it's in UAE-run detention centers or Houthi-run detention centers. And again, no one has been held accountable at any level, at the most local level to the highest international level. And I think that poses a real problem going forward.
You're the one Yemeni on the panel. We did have another Yemeni panelist, but unfortunately she was unable to attend at the last minute. But just following up on what she said about accountability, do you feel that Yemen could come forward in a unified manner, considering the fact that so many people have been hurt, that the communities have been so fractured, and the violations within that arena have been so intense? I mean, torture, detention on both sides. I mean, we often hear about the violations by or alleged violations by Saudi Arabia, but we don't often hear so much about the Houthi detentions.
Sure. Now, war is disastrous, and because of the war, the country is obviously fragmented. But we need to step back and see the rich historical context here. Running Yemen is extremely difficult. It requires a delicate balance of tribal, regional, and foreign interests. And so before even this conflict, the state or the leadership, the former regime, what was the focus there is civil stability and short-term adjustments at the expense of long-term socio-economic growth. And that kind of instigated the creation of a patronage network where you have these various social elites. They have, just to kind of give them an incentive really to extend the longevity of the state. But now the country is fragmented. Yemen has never been, in modern history, unified under one leadership. So this fragmentation reflects the point that each and every area has its own cultural and political identity. And now with this war and the casualties and the external components of the intervention, the Saudis and the Emiratis, of course, this brings a kind of a unique, a challenging dynamic to the crisis. So people at the moment are so focused on basically stabilizing their living conditions. And as long as you stabilize their living conditions, this will act as a confidence-building measure to bring people to the same room. And this conflict gave us the chance to reset the social contract. And so at this point now, we can have multiple social contracts for each community, and eventually this will be a stepping stone for a greater national reconciliation at a time in the future, and hopefully soon.
Did you want to say
can I comment on that? Yeah. So our commitment to Yemen is right now on the humanitarian side, and beginning these programs, which I think as you alluded to, we're right now in the current situation kind of working from the bottom up. But our vision for reconstruction for Yemen is one, reconstruction is difficult. The infrastructure side is the easiest, might be the most expensive, but it's not complex. You build something again. But to build social cohesion, rebuild it, to focus on governance, on accountability, on transitional justice, human rights, these areas, that's the long slog that we're going to be committed to as USAID and as our program. And that's what we're starting now at the local level with a community stabilization program, which is looking to work with youth, looking for local actors that want to start on the reconstruction. And it may be at the community level now, but once there is, hopefully, a political solution, we link those programs at the local level with a national dialogue that has to be obviously run by Yemenis and their vision of a future of Yemen. But we will be there supporting, again, governance, transitional justice, accountable government, and social cohesion.
And if I could just add, pre-war Yemen was not a model of human rights.
Right.
If the conflict were not going on, I would be here with a different list of human rights concerns. We had reports we were working on child marriage that we put on hold because we had to deal with the conflict. So there is that vast range of human rights issues that were pre-existing, some of which will be exacerbated by, in the post-conflict era, in addition to some of the issues that I already raised. So it's a daunting task. I think, we've talked about sort of the range of issues, but just recall that there are these pre-existing human rights challenges as well.
When I went to the Ministry of Human Rights, there was a protest there with the women, the relatives of detained in some of the prisons, Emirati prisons. And when I told the driver I wanted to go to the Ministry of Human Rights, he looked at me like I don't know where that. He had no idea where that was. So it's new and it's got a little bit of distance to go. But what would be the plan to try to get that to be more of a common goal? How do you do that?
Well, I think to start, the international community has to be talking about it. The international community has to make clear to all parties to the conflict that human rights and compliance with the laws of war while the conflict is ongoing are requirements, baseline requirements, and that has not happened now. So it's hard to move forward from there if violations of the laws of war and war crimes are ignored for years on end. It's hard to see how the international community can then step in at some point, hopefully in the near future, to say, okay, clean slate, now we're going to talk about your domestic human rights concerns.
Do you feel that there are some that are discussed more than others, that there's a disparate nature in terms of the reporting?
Well, the reporting on airstrikes is, there's just more reporting on it for a few reasons. The first is that it's easier to report on. They're not hidden. They happen from the sky. People watch it happen. We're able to go to the field. We look at fragments of weapons. We can identify where they came from. It's amazing. U.S. weapons manufacturers like to print, their name and made in the USA on their weapons. So when you pick up pieces of them, you can figure out where they came from, even which company manufactured them when we track arms sales. We have challenges to access, and a lot of human rights groups have challenges when it comes to access as well. So, we just put out a detailed report on abuse in Houthi detention centers, but some of our access has been restricted, so we haven't been able to do some of the on-the-ground investigations that we'd really like to. And then in terms of, our model is that we try to influence violators of human rights, which are usually states or non-state actors, as well as the states that can influence them. And so we meet with the Houthis where possible. We try to meet with the Saudis and the Emiratis. They have not been very forthcoming in terms of meetings, and the entities the other states, like the US, that can influence them have not been very interested in raising human rights concerns, or in raising them to the point that they do something about it. I believe that the U.S. government has raised human rights concerns, but hasn't altered its behavior when it hasn't seen any progress. Just a couple weeks ago, Secretary Pompeo certified that the Saudis and Emiratis were taking all appropriate steps to address civilian casualties in Yemen, which is just factually inaccurate. But that was a sort of political check the box so that the U.S. could move forward with its support. So again, until those other states actually take a stand for human rights now, it's hard to see how in a post-conflict situation, they would be seen as credible actors on human rights.
And when I think about Reconstruction, I think about the next generation. And a quarter of the school-age children are not in school. There have been reports that Human Rights Watch did a report on children who are being recruited to fight. I pose this to the group. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the generation that is going to inherit Yemen and all of its issues?
That's an example, for instance, of where we work with our humanitarian colleagues who have food aid programs, but we target those, for instance, to feeding children in school, to keep them in school, to keep parents from making that tough decision of, do I send my child to school, or do they help us eat? If we have, we've launched some school-based feeding programs which do that, but they reach beyond just feeding the kids and keeping them in school by making sure that food, for instance, nutritious date bars are produced by the community. So we're providing jobs. We're also working with mothers and fathers associations to monitor that link and make sure that food is arriving and that builds community cohesion. And again, that's an example of where we can get in with that community, build credibility, and hopefully that's a relationship that we can continue beyond that. But the just humanitarian programs would focus, or the humanitarian programs would focus on the needy, just a needs-based approach. Whereas we can take that and make that food aid part of a larger, longer-term development program in terms of keeping kids in school. Now, are we covering most of the country or even a lot of the country? No. So, I mean, a lot of that problem is something that we look at and we can't touch on. But we're trying to do what we can.
Now, you posed a very important question. What's the plan for the next generation? It doesn't look good at all. I mean, it's very unfortunate. When you mentioned the education sector, it's a very fragile sector. And in both sides, or the education sector is the one that is the least relevant at the moment, unfortunately, for policymakers. The main focus is how do we stabilize the security situation, and how do we, work on this conflict and how to end it. And so what's happening now, because of mainly resource issues, salaries are not being paid for educators, and so they don't show up for work. There's no operating budget for schools across Yemen, and these buildings or these schools become empty buildings. And children are either in the street or, if they're old enough, they join a militia, they join a militia. So this is why we need, again, I'm repeating myself with the bottom-up approach, is, look at these communities, because there are community-led projects to address these issues. There is mobilization happening. It's not a perfect plan. I mean, listen, the reconstruction does not have recovery. I mean, there will always be margin of error here and there. It's a bit sloppy, but at least let's kind of empower whatever the local communities are doing for the education sector. And so I am happy at least we have a transitional education plan that was just recently released last week. And this will be used to mobilize donor resources and mobilize people on the ground too, across front lines. Now we need something for the health sector too. The health sector is very vital, and we've seen the catastrophic humanitarian conditions and the diseases spreading across the country, and so we need to focus on these two sectors in order to create some sort of a livable environment for young kids and hopefully see somewhat of a relatively better future.
I'm just curious, there was $2 billion deposited into the Central Bank of Yemen by the Saudis, another 200 million just announced. And obviously, much money donated by other entities. Where is that money going? Do you?
Yes. Okay.
Why didn't I see more
Sure.
reconstruction?
So prior to this conflict, Yemen needs about $250 million a month just to pay for food imports. So 3 billion, 2 billion, or 200 million, still this is not enough to actually intervene into the economy and jumpstart the economy. So where the money is going, with the Saudi deposit, it has its own terms of reference how it can be used, but it's mostly used to finance food imports. It cannot be used to pay for other things. So there is an actual need to help the flow of food into the country. Now remember that we import 80% of our food from outside, and 90% from this 80% is imported commercially from the private sector. So, and this private sector, they have foreign exchange needs, and this is where the money, the Saudi deposit, is primarily used for.
How do you deal with reconstruction in an area that is, the liberated areas are now controlled by the Emiratis. So as more area, if, say there's a peace plan, how do you deal with reconstruction in an area that is controlled, basically owned by a foreign power?
Well, first of all, I'll have to kind of challenge this concept of, yes, the Emiratis are there, but do they own an area and they control the communities and they dictate the policy? They have their own military installations and they have another arm, and I'm not going to speak on their behalf, but there are local communities who are, doing something. People want to continue living, and we don't want, and I'm using this term, we don't want to create a Solidaire Avenue, like what happened in Lebanon, or a big Marshall Plan here. The financing needs of these communities is pretty limited and not that large. And so there can be an intervention without this notion that you need to have this sort of mega plan in place and adhere this various framework of rigid framework in order to achieve these big projects. These are small projects that I'm talking about that help in stabilizing the situation. Of course, the Emiratis, they have their own, we hear this in the news, they have their own humanitarian assistances, their input on stabilizing the regions where they are. But it has to be subnationally led. There should be an ownership, a local community ownership, before it can be really introduced from outside.
And we're prepared to work with the Emiratis, with the Saudis, and their development arms in order to deepen their understanding of what positive investments into reconstruction would mean. I think to date, a lot of their assistance and other Gulf countries has gone to the humanitarian effort, and I think rightly so. But as that dialogue deepens, and hopefully there is a horizon for a political settlement, which will necessitate an even more robust reconstruction effort, that they'll certainly be in the mix. And they've kind of reached out and been asking for technical assistance from donors to deepen their understanding of what they could offer on the development side.
And what about on the accountability side? How do you go forward there?
Well, the UN has just renewed the mandate for the investigative mechanism out of Geneva. The report from the group of eminent experts that came out about 6 weeks ago, I thought was a good start. But that's reporting. We do reporting too. There's a lot of reporting. It's not what is happening. The violations are clear. They can be documented more and more robustly, but there really is no accountability mechanism right now. And I think the U.S. and And other partners of the Saudis and Emiratis are really the ones who need to be pressing them and saying, you will not have our continued support unless and until you start holding people accountable. Now, the coalition does have an investigative mechanism. They've set it up with the help of the US. The US essentially built it for them. But it's entirely inadequate. When it does investigate, it generally absolves the coalition of wrongdoing. On a couple of occasions, it's found either technical mistakes or errors, or a couple of instances where it did find some kind of, some actual error. We have documented maybe a handful of cases of compensation. So when you think about those numbers I said at the outset, 6,500 civilians killed, 10,000 plus wounded, maybe half a dozen families have received some kind of compensation for their loss. And that's to say nothing of property damage and so on. So it's pretty grim unless and until donors start demanding something and the coalition members feel like they have to do something. And that doesn't address the detention issues, which we've touched on briefly. I don't expect a tremendous amount of accountability from the Houthis, but in a post-reconstruction world, people can and should be prosecuted for things like unlawful detention and torture. They can and should be prosecuted now, but more realistically, it would happen in the future. But I don't think that anyone is in a position to map that out yet, because the post-reconstruction world could start next week, or it could start years from now.
Well, and I don't think we're anywhere close to a post-reconstruction world. So, I mean, that's why this panel, I think it's important, but it's also a bit of, it blows my mind a little bit, because, there is still such an active conflict and humanitarian crisis going on. But it is important to think about these things. I want to open it up in just a minute, but I want to give you all a chance to say sort of final words.
Well, just based on what you just said, I think we can do both. We can, taking a look at the I won't even say long term, the medium term, a world where there is a transition and a political settlement on the horizon, and we can deal with a unified state. I think we can do that at the same time without letting our foot off the pedal on supporting a robust humanitarian response. So,
this is just off the cuff, but say a peace plan involved a power sharing where the Houthis maintained part of their territory. Would you all have had no presence in Sana'a, so how would USAID go forward in that scenario?
Well, that would obviously have to be a conversation that we'd have across the interagency, and it would depend on the nature of the settlement. I mean, I think ideally what we want is a unified Yemen, is one Yemen, and we'd want to be working with national institutions that are recognized by Yemenis as representative of their nation. So, depending on the details of it, I imagine a future with a relationship with a single national entity. But a lot of our work takes place on the ground at the community level as well. And so I think what we'd ideally be doing is taking our work that we've been doing now at the community level and with some national institutions, and linking that to the nature of the political dialogue, to the nature of the agreement, and having the kind of robust dialogue that we heard about in the first panel that took place several years ago, which is bringing Yemenis together. And what kind of country do they want? What level of decentralization or regionalization or centralization do they want in the economy, in service delivery, and social institutions? So again, it has to be a Yemeni response, and I think we react accordingly.
Well, for me, I'm not as optimistic for reaching a peaceful solution to this crisis anytime soon. I mean, honestly, what we've seen this last effort by the UN to put everyone on the same table, and it didn't work. It's likely that it will continue not to work. And so you are left with this problematic situation. I mean, first of all, I commend USAID's efforts in Yemen. You switched from humanitarian to economic development, and your work with the Central Bank of Yemen was very important. But there are other geoeconomic factors that will determine the rate of assistance Yemen will get from the outside. And mostly we're looking at the GCC for our primary funding needs, Saudi Arabia and the other GCC countries. And these countries are involved militarily in Yemen too. So there needs to be an understanding, an incentive in place, and better understand the variables of how we can mobilize resources now, greater resources to channel the needed resources for the recovery needs or reconstruction needs of these various communities that live in the areas liberated by the government. I mean, again, the government does not have much resources. I mean, they have there's this fragmented country where they cannot really generate the resources there's no centralized account where all these resources are flowing to. And so you need an intervention, an external intervention. And so Yemen's recovery needs is really, for now, is determined by these geo-economic factors in place. I don't know, I'd like to add something to
In short, on the human rights side, if we want to see a difference, Washington has to say to Riyadh, we're not selling you any more arms until you stop killing civilians unlawfully. Unless that happens, the Saudis and the coalition will just continue unabated.
Okay. Are there any questions? Open it up to the audience.
Hi, Tom Frank from Arab Weekly. A question for you, Andrea. You heard the Assistant Secretary talk about wanting to keep the pressure up, basically, on the Saudis and the coalition, and that the certification wasn't a sort of good housekeeping seal of approval. What's your reaction to him saying we're going to keep watching?
Do you want to take a few, or should I go ahead?
Go ahead and answer that.
They've been watching for a long time, but the U.S. hasn't just been watching. The U.S. has been materially contributing to the conflict and supporting the coalition. So that's in part why I think it's so essential that the U.S. take a stand. The U.S. refuels jets, it provides targeting information, it shares intelligence. So the U.S. does not have clean hands. It's not simply a matter of calling up a partner in the diplomatic arena and saying, we don't like what you're doing. The U.S. needs to change its conduct, in addition to cutting off arms sales until the Saudis and the Emiratis change their behavior.
We'll go to this side, and if you could just remember to identify yourselves.
Yes, Wendy Chamberlain, formerly of the Middle East Institute. Let me congratulate the Middle East Institute for this conference. In many ways, Yemen has been the forgotten war. We all talk about Syria, North Korea, Ukraine. Thank you for the Middle East Institute for focusing repeatedly and constantly on Yemen, because I think it's a situation that really requires focus. And I congratulate the panel. I agree with everything you say. But I think we're probably members of the same political tribe within the United States. But there's another tribe that when we say, and you suggest solutions, the United States needs to focus on the human rights, the United States needs to mobilize the international community for greater resources. My question is, how do you get to the other tribe that is not focused on Yemen, that is not really supportive of increasing foreign aid, that doesn't put a high priority on human rights and international law and multilateral solutions? To me, that's the hardest problem, hardest nut to crack in finding a solution to such a compelling crisis as we have in Yemen.
Who wants to take? Does that?
I can start by just noting, to answer that question, you'd have to talk about two issues which we have not discussed yet. One is the ongoing conflict between the US and AQAP in Yemen, which is separate from this war, which used to be what we talked about when we talked about Yemen. And the second is Iran. And we don't have time to fully discuss that, but disputes about the degree of influence that Iran plays in Yemen, I think, are at the heart of the disagreements in Washington about how to respond.
And I would say that Washington is not just is not a narrow thing. I mean, we're Washington as well. I mean, part of this dialogue contributes to the understanding of Yemen and to kind of amplifies its importance to the USG, to American citizens, to our values. So I think that while at first blush, Yemen might not be on the radar of everybody. I know that when we talk about Yemen, we don't only talk within USAID, we talk at the interagency, we talk to the Hill, we have these kind of discussions, and that amplifies and it helps to amplify the importance of Yemen and why it's important that we continue. I mean, we do have a fairly robust budget for Yemen. The program that I laid out is about $200 million. We have certainly over the last year and a half, we've put in 1.2 billion U.S. taxpayer dollars on the humanitarian side. And I think I certainly can't speak for our Congress, who are our funders, but I think if peace breaks out in Yemen, I think we can count on continued support. So I think the words are one thing, but the resources sometimes are something else.
Peter Humphrey, intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. First, an appeal to everybody in this building to stop calling Houthis Shia. They are Zaidis, and there are substantial differences between those two. My question is there anything we can do to break the cot economy, which routinely absorbs perhaps 15-20% of everything that goes on in Yemen? Can we patrol offshore to prevent importation? Can we get fatwa from prominent clerics to stop this very un-Islamic practice? What can we do?
Is it the qat?
Kant, yeah.
Oh.
Maybe you could take that one.
Yeah, sure. No, I can. No, qat is embedded in Yemen's culture since the 70s, I think. And the idea, so qat is linked to northwest of Yemen. It has this tribal nature to it. It's used in social settings. Yes, it is bad for the economy, but it has this cultural dimension to it that is extremely difficult to kind of, it has its own economy, its own politics. And so there needs to be a dialogue, a nationwide dialogue and understanding of how to approach qat. Now with the Houthis in Sana'a, the Houthis have a lot of interest, a lot of economic interest in the cultivation of qat. The Houthis have created this informal economy around qat because they tax qat and they encourage farmers because this is a lucrative product and a lot of resources can be mobilized. About fatwa, and I know that there are Muslim clerics in Yemen, they chew qat, most of them. So I don't think that qat is our imminent problem. I think it's a long-term issue. We've been trying to work on qat for over the past decade or so, but it provides livelihoods for now. People are getting money and they're feeding their families. And the reason why northwest of Yemen is not suffering really from famine like what's happening in the coastal regions is because of this agricultural community that has been supporting each other, and qat is a factor of it. So that's my input. I don't know if you'd like to add.
I actually thought I heard him use the word corruption when he said something. I thought I heard the culture of corruption, which we haven't really we haven't really discussed
corruption
too much. But dealing with that going forward, I mean, a massive challenge.
For qat, yes. Which one? For
corruption? For corruption.
For corruption too.
No, corruption is we've been suffering from corruption from a long time ago. And I said earlier that running Yemen requires this delicate balance of tribal and other interests. And the patronage system was developed as a mean for social control, and so there was a payout dividend to these very powerful social groups. And so now this patronage system is unwind, but you still have cronies here and there in the private sector who are still interests and who are using corruption and bureaucracy as a form of barrier for new entrants into the economy and so on. So it's a long-term channel. But for donors, let me just very quickly add this. Yes, donors should not be using corruption as a reason not to intervene in Yemen. We can carve out institutions like similar to the Social Fund for Development, where they have an institutional setup that adheres to a higher standards of transparency and accountability, and so that this is something that we can work on in the near future.
Starting from the bottom up.
Well, for this one, it's top, bottom. But yes, I'd rather prefer bottom up.
Okay, over here.
Laurie Krieger from the Manoff Group. That was a good answer, was a great seg to what I want to ask, which is what is happening to traditional social structure with all the disruption of the war? What's happening to traditional accountability, say with tribal leaders? What's happening with the tribes?
Do you want me to? So what happens is this: when you have the governments, when there is an absence of a government structure in an area, old millennial customs intervene, and they act as a safety net. And they've been, so local communities and tribes have been very productive and effective in conflict resolution. There was this news recently that prisoner swaps happened between the various tribes who are fighting with each other, and security is maintained by these sort of social and ancient social, customs that have been effectively used by the local communities. So no, they are now amplified in many regions across Yemen.
I guess I would also throw to you, Bruce, in following up that how these large institutions can work with the tribal leaders and work more with the, as he was saying, from the bottom up, how you're able to reach those entities currently when you don't have a lot of staff on the ground, how you can go forward with those.
Well, as I mentioned before, we recognized as we're designing our programs that we don't have the staff on the ground. We do have a history of decades in Yemen, but we've been out for at least 3 years. We initially did a study looking at who was on the ground, and we were surprised that there's 20 to 30 international NGOs with development experience, and then a lot of really pretty sophisticated Yemeni NGOs. So I know this is kind of being bureaucratic and process-oriented here, but when we put out our solicitations, we had very, very general goals, and the idea being to bring out the best ideas and what can be done on the ground. So what we've got is a series of programs, and we're just launching a new stabilization program now. And our question was and is, what works? What credibility does the implementing partner have in this area, that area? And it's going to be a different approach according to the regions. And it's going to be based on their knowledge on the ground. We also, though, have a third-party monitoring contract that goes in and looks to see that results are being achieved and also gives us some atmospherics about what's happening on the ground. Granted, we're handicapped and it's difficult to not be actually in Yemen, but we're doing what we can with the knowledge of our partners who are on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Al-Khadr Suleiman, Yafa Community Center based in Brooklyn, New York. One of the main issues that is coming up in your comments is the lack of services in the liberated areas, which represent the former South Yemen. I think one of the main frustrations that continues to feed this conflict is that the southern people's legitimate representation is not included in the peace talks. It's very likely that their inclusion may end the war. How long will the southern people be held hostage by this war by a dysfunctional Yemeni government when they decide to take action into their own hands and unilaterally declare their own state? How can we ensure that when a peace settlement or a peace negotiation begins, that the southern people, or in particular the SDC, will be included so we can avoid another war and ensure that the peace deal is actually implemented on the ground?
So regardless where you are in Yemen, south, north, east, west, you as a human being, you have your basic needs and essential services in Aden and areas in Yafa. The interruption of these essential services is just unacceptable. We need to maintain a basic level of living standards. Otherwise, yes, people will be frustrated. They will take a very aggressive political stance concerning the unity of Yemen. And speaking about the unity, I mean, that's my personal take. It will take time. I mean, we saw what happened in Scotland, for example. They take so many years to prepare, to arrange some sort of a mechanism to make sure that everyone's voice is included in the South on what is it that they want for the future of Yemen and for their future, whether they want to maintain unity, independence, or reach a middle ground of a federal system in place. And so we have to first of all stabilize the humanitarian situation, provide the basic living of standards, and then there needs to be a discussion about these very serious topics eventually. And in the National Dialogue Conference, there was some sort of an exercise on discussing the southern issue and so forth. But me, as an economic development standpoint, I think that it is critical that before we engage in all these matters, which are long-term matters, we need to stabilize Yemen and then engage into these things in a serious way. I mean, that's the, oh, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Thank you again to the panel. Something I wanted to jump back to was how we address transitional justice moving forward and addressing human rights violations that have been perpetrated during this conflict when previous violations may not have been addressed. Robert Dolan from Amar International. This is something that we regularly encounter in Iraq with our human rights violations documenters, in how a community can move forward when past grievances have not been addressed. And I'd be particularly interested in how Human Rights Watch or AID in future programming we can address those issues and kind of tie up ends that might have been grievances from the past and how we move forward in those. Thank you.
The challenge with transitional justice is that it generally works at the local level, and there absolutely is a need for that in Yemen, but the bulk of the violations are occurring at an international level by external actors. So they wouldn't be included in, I can't think of how they could be included in a transitional justice plan, although I think that's a good question. From my view, it's incumbent on the international community now to seek to hold those states accountable, largely the coalition. As I said, we could certainly seek to hold the Houthis accountable, it's just harder. There are many options that the international community is just choosing not to engage in when it comes to trying to address coalition violations. And I think that is going to have some long-term effects. If it's true, as we hear, the Saudis are going to be key when it comes to reconstruction, they're also key to slaughtering civilians right now. So the framework of how to incorporate them into Yemen's future, I think, presents a lot of challenges. And of course, they have a lifelong relationship and always will geographically. And the Emiratis as well have made it clear that they have a long-term interest in Yemen. It's not clear what that will look like in the future. So they will be there. But it's hard to see how they will be accepted as partners in reconstruction when right now they're responsible for so many harms.
So not to negate your observations on the international level, to add to that, though, and kind of a transitional justice approach that maybe we've taken in other places and we might take here if we're helping out in that front, will be largely defined by the nature of the peace settlement and what the role of the Houthis is, what the role of other players are, and we'll support if it's decided a Truth Commission model, or maybe working a kind of community healing model at from the bottom up, as we say. Maybe both approaches. I think we'll be there at the table, but we'll be the nature of our support will be driven by the nature of the peace settlement.
And if I may add one last thing. Yes, Saudi Arabia is a permanent neighbor of Yemen, and we share political, economic, and social ties. Remember that there are 2 million Yemenis living in Saudi Arabia. So there's a big interest in maintaining or in maintaining stability in Yemen for Saudi Arabia. Now, for the war and the current conflict, it's in everyone's interest to end it as soon as possible. But unfortunately, the situation is still fluid, it's still difficult. But the Saudis have started, using their own modality in channeling aid. And we need to kind of, if they feel free, if they feel more comfortable using their own modality, using the King Salman Relief Foundation, it is fine. And it is encouraging too that we see other international partners who are working with the regional actors to kind of enhance these various modalities. And it is very critical for us to ensure that we have a peace in our direct neighborhood with Saudi Arabia, and we cannot afford to have otherwise. So we have to make it possible. We'll have to make it work, basically. And so this is my remark on this.
On the note of making it work, I'll close just after 4. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you to the Institute.
Thank you, Marcia, and thanks to all of today's speakers for an interesting and I hope informative conversation. As we've learned, and as I think many of the people in this room already knew, the situation in Yemen is highly complex, challenging, and critical. And achieving peace in Yemen, especially a sustainable peace, is not going to be an easy task. Thanks again to Garda World for your support for this conference, and thank you to all of you who've attended or have joined us via live stream. We look forward to seeing you all this fall at MEI's annual conference and gala as well. Thank you very much.